I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian, and welcome to The Sidebar, a weekly show on the community, arts, culture, and more. Today we're talking to Daniel Keel. He's a professor, author, one of the co-chairs of an event benefiting Facing History and Ourselves. So stay with us for a conversation with Daniel. Daniel, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Let's talk about the event. It's a fundraiser benefiting Facing History and Ourselves. We'll talk a little bit later about deeper into what Facing History is. But the event is Thursday, September 12th at 6 p.m. at the Scheit Family Performing Arts Center at the U of M. It's a fundraiser. Is it the big annual fundraiser for
it? It is. It's the annual benefit for Facing History. We've been doing it here in Memphis for many, many years. We're bringing in great speakers. You'll hear from teachers. You'll hear from students. You'll hear from Freedom Singers. It's a group, the Center for Transforming Communities. Will do a little performance, and then I'll have an opportunity to have a conversation with Carol Anderson, who is a professor at Emory. And so that will be, the substance of the night as well.
Let's do 30 seconds. The brief, for people who aren't familiar with Facing History, what is Facing History? And we'll talk deeper later in the show.
Facing History does professional development for teachers. It uses moments in history to teach students about citizenship, belonging, equity, justice, those kinds of things. So they have units on the Holocaust, units on choices in Little Rock, the Little Rock 9, desegregation, and they use those things to get students to think about their own identities, their own places in the community, and get them to choose to participate as citizens.
Yeah. We'll talk more about the program, and I've been to this event. It's an annual event. I think I've been to a couple of them here. It's really amazing, and you get to hear from the students. You get to hear not just the speakers or the keynote. I can't remember who when I've been there, but it is a really great night, so I will put that in. But in terms of what you'll be talking about with Carol Anderson, it jives with some of the things you've done in terms of your work as a professor at U of M. You're a law professor, but you focus on lots of issues of inequality in the education system. I think you said you fell into doing a documentary sort of some years ago on the desegregation of Memphis schools. So talk about what people hear if they're able to go and hear from Professor Anderson and you at the event.
So I will speak a little bit about Professor Anderson. Her work in this instance is going to be on voting. And, we're in an election year, and Facing History is all about engagement and civic participation, and what better topic than voting. Professor Anderson's work is on sort of these competing narratives that exist in the voting space, in the voting rights space. There's some that talk about voter suppression and other people that talk about voter fraud and those kind of competing narratives. My own work, I taught a voting rights class this summer. I teach constitutional law, which obviously connects to a lot of this stuff as well. And so she's going to be, talking about the sort of heavy lifting of democracy, which I think is what voting being a central piece of that. So I think that's what she's hoping to share. And, teachers and students and members of the community just kind of be reminded of that history of voting discrimination, but also connect it to what's going on today.
I'm trying to think, it is interesting with voting in my history of voting. So I'm over 50 now. So I've been voting for a while. And for many phases of my life, voting was a non-issue other than it was maybe a hassle. Like I was in college and I had to do, vote by mail or an absentee vote. Or in New York, I remember voting when I lived here. Then it became a big deal in 2000 with Bush v. Gore. And suddenly you're like, oh, wow, there's all this sort of nuance and there's all these questions and hang chads. And then obviously in 2020 with the insurrection and everything that happened, when Biden won and Trump lost, there was just suddenly you realize, oh yeah, this voting is a fragile thing. And there's a tremendous amount of trust. It's both, fundamentally the math of how many votes, but there's all this other contextual stuff that goes on. And it's interesting how, and it's going to be a big issue this year and down to the wire in some states and counties and questions about election boards and what it means to have a free and fair election.
Right.
So in the years you've been doing this and writing about it, and again, I don't want you to speak for Professor Anderson, but it seems like the work she's done for many years is really on the table as we go into this election this year.
Absolutely. I think there's a tendency to look back when we think about voting rights and we think about Selma, or we think about poll taxes or literacy tests, things that have been used in the past to keep people from voting. And I think a lot of people sort of picking up on your own narrative, a lot of people think, oh, well, those are things in the past, and voting has become more and more open and easy and free and fair. And I think what, in the law space, but also the work of Professor Anderson is trying to do is to sort of pick up on those nuances that show that there are other ways that aren't so obvious, that aren't literacy tests or poll taxes, that are things that impact how votes get cast, how votes get counted. These are things, that run from gerrymandering to long lines at the polls to what kind of technology we use. And so all of those details that go all the way from who can register to vote to how your votes get counted all the way through are really things that can impact. And I think the goal of, one of my goals, and I think one of hers as well, would be to just get people more aware that there's more machinery at work here than just showing up on the election day and casting your vote.
And it is interesting too, because in Tennessee, we really, in a lot of ways, we're very convenient voting. I mean, early voting is real easy. It's 2 weeks, 3 weeks almost of early voting. You can kind of go into any place around town. You can beat the lines on election day. I can remember going on election day in various places that didn't have early voting. And it's a huge pain. And it's a real, either you take time off from work or you got to get there and be ready to wait for a couple hours. And again, in some ways, there are laws in Tennessee that are make it much easier to vote. I think the ID, there's questions about how, voter ID, there's questions about, other things that maybe aren't as free and fair, and free and fair is not the right word, but as helpful as they might be in Tennessee. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think that rather than looking at what we had in the past, which is wholesale disenfranchisement, you have counties in Alabama with 3 African-American voters registered when most of the county population is black. And so we don't see that kind of wholesale disenfranchisement in that way, but we do see in more subtle and nuanced ways things that can impact how easy it is to vote. So you mentioned voter ID, but of course there's in Tennessee we have felon disenfranchisement that ensures that large numbers of people aren't able to register to vote at all, and then little marginal things like where the poll locations are can impact different populations in different ways. And so what I think is important for people to pay attention to is, what are the cumulative effects of those kinds of things? A lot of those things are put in play to protect the integrity of voting, which I think is absolutely central. But they end up having disproportionate impacts on different populations and making it marginally more difficult to vote without an outright ban like we might have had in the past.
I remind everyone, we're talking to Daniel Keel. He's a professor at the U of M, author. He's one of the co-chairs of an event benefiting Facing History Ourselves. That event is Thursday, September 12th at 6 p.m. at the Scheit Family Performing Arts Center. It is ticketed, and it's a fundraiser, so it's a very expensive set of tickets, right? People can get tickets. They go to facinghistory.org, I believe.
Right.
That's right. But also, you want to talk about students and teachers and getting them engaged.
We want people there. This is a great opportunity to hear from Facing History students, from Facing History teachers, from, speakers and other members of the community. And so we want to make sure that people, especially students and teachers and people affiliated with schools, have the opportunity to be there. So I'll just go ahead and say, if that fits you, then reach out to southeast@facinghistory.org and let them know that you're interested in being there, and we'll figure out a way to make that happen.
We'll talk more about the event in Facing History and Daniel's background. Let me do a bit of housekeeping, though. Remind everyone that I'm Eric Barnes. This is The Sidebar, which airs on WYXR 91.7 every Thursday at 11:30. Focused on the community, arts, culture, everything in between. But it's not just a radio show. It's one of many weekly podcasts we do at the Daily Memphian, including Bill Dries' Politics podcast. I should also take a moment to remind everyone that we are in the Crosstown Atrium away from our studio still, although we hope to get our new studio built by January. So you hear noises in the background sometimes. And that's just we just do it live, right, Natalie? It's just live to tape, and it makes everyone very happy. Nonetheless, one of many weekly podcasts we do at the Daily Memphian, including Bill Dries' Politics podcast, On the Record. We do the Memphis Grizzlies podcast, which is obviously ramping up now with Drew Hill and Chris Harrington. And we do our food podcast, Sound Bites, that's hosted by Jennifer Chandler, and which also airs here on WYXR every Thursday at 11. We also host the podcast version of Behind the Headlines, the show we produce with WKNO every week. And all of our podcasts are on the Daily Memphian site, as well as iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get the WYXR shows, this show and Sound Bites and all the shows that WYXR produces, music and talk. You can get that at WYXR.org or on the WYXR app. And also, if you aren't a supporter of WYXR, do consider becoming one. It's nonprofit listener-supported radio. You can become a member and get all kinds of benefit, or you can do just a one-off donation. And last, Daily Memphian is also a nonprofit, the largest newsroom in the region. And if you haven't become a paid subscriber, please do consider becoming one. That's what really supports what we do with our nearly 40 journalists, freelancers, all that goes into running a news organization like Daily Memphian. Coming up in the coming weeks on the sidebar, we have musician Greg Cartwright. We also have Josh Campbell from Spill It. Recently, we had Craig Brewer, the filmmaker, talking about Fight Night, the new series. He's an executive producer and one of the directors on. I think he directed half the episode. We talked some about Fight Night, but more about the state of streaming, and also a really interesting conversation with him about just even still, as successful as Craig is, the struggle of getting work produced. I think he said that at this point, only 1 in 15 of his proposals actually ever gets produced, which is a pretty shocking number when you think about how successful he's been. We also had Willie Bearden, filmmaker and writer. He has a new book out. That was a great conversation just because Willie is always really fun to talk to. And again, I mentioned Behind the Headlines coming up soon. This week, we've actually got a number of the new school board members for the Memphis Shelby County School Board. And we've got Marie Fagans coming up, the superintendent. That's in a couple weeks. Also, Paul Young, mayor of Memphis, is coming on, I think, in 3, 4, 5 weeks, something like that, pretty soon. Recently on Behind the Headlines, we had Doug McGowan and folks, the science director from Protect Our Aquifer, talking about gray water plants, the XAI facility, all kinds of things about MLGW. And Tina Sullivan, the outgoing head of Overton Park Conservancy, was on talking about history of that organization. And they just named their new executive director, Casey Murley, who's will be taking over, I think, in the coming weeks if she hasn't already. We just had our most recent business seminar for the Daily Memphian. Our small business seminar was September 4th, just yesterday. It had Beverly Robertson and Ryan Robertson, her son, Scott Tashy from City Silo, Monique Williams from Biscuits and Jam. If you missed that, you can go to Daily Memphian, just search for the small business seminar, and you can get the full video of that and hear folks talking about their struggles and successes with small businesses. And our Developing Memphis seminar is coming up in October. That's October 24th. But we are here with Daniel Keel, again, professor and author, and one of the co-chairs of an event benefiting Facing History and Ourselves. Why did you, and I should say you're co-chair with your wife, Megan Keel. Yep. People know for having run for city council, being an advocate in town, in the city. Why did you, it sort of fits with the work you've done when you read your bio, but maybe other organizations fit with the work you do and your interest, but why did you, it's a lot to be a co-chair and be on the local advisory board. Why was this so important to you? Sure.
Facing History's work with students and with young people, I think, is absolutely essential work because it's so easy for teachers, especially with the way that we have, state standards and standardized testing, and for students to sort of check out, especially in social studies where, even the standardized tests aren't even as sort of valuable as the English and math, which are weighted. Facing History coursework does not allow students to be disengaged. It is connecting them, inspiring them to be involved, engaged, to learn more. So much of my own work, I feel like, is inspired by the same kinds of ideas of Facing History, which is sort of looking backwards, seeing sort of what's happened in the past, studying it really critically, understanding it from lots of different angles, understanding that it's made up of decisions that people make, just regular old people that are put in particular situations and make decisions, and that those decisions end up affecting the trajectory of history. And I think it's really important for students to get the sense that they are those people too, that the choices they make can affect not just their own lives, but the lives of their community. So it's really inspiring work. The curriculums that they put together are world class. So I have a lot of faith in, just sort of the content that Facing History puts together. Megan, you mentioned her first job out of college was actually at the national office at Facing History in Boston. And so we have a long history with Facing History as well. And so, you mentioned the benefit. I think it's been described as, the soul of Memphis, is going to be in that audience. And so it's people that come together that see the opportunities that our young people have to sort of create a Memphis that is stronger and that is engaged and that is filled with wonderful citizens.
There's, not to go super political, but I mean, there's got to be some amount of folks who just push back on not necessarily the idea that bad things happened in the past, right, around race and desegregation and some of the things we're talking about here and voter suppression. But they're kind of like, hey, that was in the past. Why do we have to dwell on it? And I've heard that from people that sometimes it surprises me, that are incredibly engaged in the city, incredibly engaged in making this place better. One of the ones you'll hear sometimes is people say, well, it was a mistake to put the Civil Rights Museum here because it puts a spotlight on one of the worst events in Memphis and the nation's history, right? It was not just a Memphis event. I mean, it was a national event. That sort of pushback on the idea that why do we dwell in the past? What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I see things very differently, I guess. That's the first response. I was a history major in college, and so much of my work as a professor is rooted in looking backwards to sort of understand how we got to the place we got. And I would say that for me, I think when we look at our community and we see things aren't perfect, and there's a lot of reasons why that might be so. And I think that failing to have a fully informed understanding of how things got to be the way they are, that it wasn't just by natural evolution, it was by choices that people made. And they might not have been choices that intentionally took the city in whatever direction that it went, but they were choices. And that those choices, sort of inform how we got to where we are. And I think that that's really important. I think the Civil Rights Museum is a great example of this as well. I mean, I think that the work of a museum like the Civil Rights Museum and the work of Facing History is very complementary to one another because, what they're doing is trying to ensure that we don't forget what happened in the past, but also, I think, just looking at or dwelling, as you might say, that's not helpful. I think that what Facing History is doing, or what the Civil Rights Museum is doing as well, is trying to empower people, right? It's not about dwelling on what happened in the past. It's about understanding what happened in the past so that people can feel empowered to shape today and shape, tomorrow as well, especially with Facing History's, focus on young people, making sure.
I've said this before. I think for me, growing up in Tacoma, Washington, up in the Northwest, I always joke with people that history in the Northwest starts with Lewis and Clark. That's when you get real serious about U.S. history. It's a really weird dynamic. And when I went to school and lived in the Northeast, I would tell people that, and they're like, what? They didn't think about, that was like a small part of their, history in high school, because that was so other. So even things, and this sounds ridiculous, but even things like the Civil War, when you were in public school in a okay public school, even an AP history public school course in Tacoma, Washington, you talk about the Civil War, but that was not the defining thing. It was the reservation system. It was Lewis and Clark. It was the discovery of gold. It was the gold rush. It was all of those kinds of things. And the other thing is that it's not a particularly diverse community. And most of the Northwest certainly just doesn't have, you go to Portland, you go to Seattle, you go to Tacoma, not big Black population. So when I moved to Memphis, it was a fascinating realization of how people talk about race. And I actually, I don't think looking at history as a way of sort of dwelling in the past. In part, I think the more people talk about it and the way people talk about race in Memphis is by and large really healthy. It's more out, you talk about it. You have Black friends, you have Black coworkers. It's much more out front, if imperfectly. And so that to me, somehow everything what I know about facing history, it's more about that. Like, let's talk about the things let's help facilitate a conversation about the things we maybe already talk about and some of the things we don't talk about and how that is grounded in history and how we move forward,
Yeah, and I would say a couple things. First, facing history has a long track record of doing what you're describing in a really skilled way. Running these conversations can be challenging and difficult, and teaching this kind of material can be, can lead to difficult conversations. And Facing History is expert in this, and they've been doing it for many years. And one of the reasons why I think they're so good is that you're talking about, your own local history and local experience and how that shapes sort of what happens in your classroom. But taking it down even to the sort of most local of all is the individual person. And almost all of Facing History's work, almost all of its pedagogy begins with the person. Who am I? What is my identity? And how does that affect how I am interacting with these kinds of questions? And I think that that's such a powerful thing. I think that is such a way of centering the student so that this isn't just some story that happened some time ago to some stranger. This connects to something totally different that's maybe happening in my world, in my community, and in my personal life.
You've been we were talking before, professor at U of M, law professor. Yep. For, would you say 17 years?
I think this is the beginning of my 17th year.
Yeah. How do you, with students and all these kinds of issues, is the conversation, it's changed some or a lot about these kinds of issues as it plays out in the classroom and the school setting, the university setting?
Yeah, I feel like my conversations don't change as much as the content that we're covering or the topic that we talk about changes. I think, so I teach constitutional law, which is constantly developing. Each year there's a case that happens in the middle of the semester.
And there hasn't been anything constitutional or Supreme Court. I can't think of a single case that's happened in the last few months that would be of relevance to your classroom.
Right, I can't. It's crazy. But yeah, so there are things that happened between the last class and the exam that students will panic and send me a message. Do we need to focus on that? I'm like, no. Just what we taught. But I also teach an education and essentially it's an education and race class. And that's a much more discussion-based course where we're exploring, the history of schooling in the United States and the disparities that exist today and the disparities, the roots of those disparities. And in a lot of ways, it's very much a Facing History type class. And what I find is that the conversations they're different, obviously, because it's a different group of students every year, but they're focusing on the same kinds of things, which, leads me to believe that people are concerned with the same kinds of things over time, and the content of of how it might show up might be different from year to year. We might be talking about vouchers one year, or we might be talking about a school district merger another time, or we might be talking, about affirmative action in more recent years. And so the subject matter changes, but the content of the discussion is all about using schools in a way that can empower students, using schools in a way that can distribute opportunity more equally and more equitably among students so that their students' lives trajectories aren't impacted by where they happen to be assigned to go to school. And, that connects to issues of funding and administration and governance, law school type stuff. But it's drawing on, I think, my law students' sense of, the power of education to sort of shape a community moving forward. And I see that year after year, and I feel really lucky to get to do it because students are so passionate about this.
You have a new boss down there. What's his name? Tim Brickland. Tim Brickland. He was a city councilman.
I think that
right?
rhymes with it. It's Jim Strickland.
It's Jim Strickland.
You got it.
Jim Strickland. What is he? Any new rules? Any new policies? Is he just like cracking down on you guys?
No, he is learning on the job. I think he did a lot of work this summer to get a sense of what our jobs entail and the sort of way that a law school and a university runs. He's got some ideas for ways in which we can draw students and raise money and, sort of build on what I think is a really strong foundation for the only law school in town, right? So we have a real unique situation, the wonderful connection we have with the local bar. And so much of our community is U of M law alums.
Yeah.
And so that's really neat.
Yeah. It's a random question, but it's the kind of thing I can talk about for like 20 minutes. What percentage, give or take, of your students do not end up practicing law? Give or take.
In the short term or in the long term?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I say that because I know so many people more in my work life who are not practicing lawyers, who work in business, and years later they'll be like, oh no, I went to law school. Yeah, and it was great, but I either practiced for a little bit or I didn't practice at all. But I don't regret it. I don't know. I took it and went this different direction.
You are making the pitch that I try to make to my students. We just have an incoming class of 1Ls that have just started a couple weeks ago, and one of the things I said to them was, know that at this point in your law career, and even when you graduate, you will not even know 10% of the things that having a law degree can help you do.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna punt on picking a percentage of people who end up practicing law, but I'm a huge believer that people with law degrees and that the study of law, obviously this is in my professional self-interest to have this position.
Sure.
But that you can do anything. It's a problem-solving degree in a lot of ways, and it's a way of thinking. And so it doesn't surprise me that you find out, and I assume that everyone that you find out was a lawyer is someone that is an incredible person.
Yeah, most of them. Yeah, they are. Actually, the ones I'm thinking of all are. We're just about out of time. Your first concert that you ever went to?
I went to Beastie Boys and Run DMC at the Mid-South Coliseum.
That's a good one.
When I was in second or third grade.
Wow, your parents.
With my parents.
Parents, that's awesome.
Yes, I was really, really into the Beastie Boys and Run DMC at that phase.
That's awesome.
That was a special one.
What's the first show you bought, with your own money, you bought a ticket? Do you remember? Or one of the first?
Maybe like Dave Matthews Band at the Mud Island Amphitheater.
Mud Island Amphitheater. There you go. There you go. That's good. Well, Daniel Keel, thanks so much for being here again. One of the co-chairs of an event, benefit for Facing History and Ourselves. That's Thursday, September 12th at 6 p.m. It's a ticketed event. It's a fundraiser. So do go to Facing History. You can get tickets. If you're a teacher or a student, you can email southeast@facinghistory.org, and you all will try to get them in there at not with the full boat price that the fundraiser entails. Is that right?
That's right.
All right. That is all the time we have this week. Again, if you missed any of the show, you can go to wyxr.org. You can go to the Daily Memphian or wherever you get your podcast to get the complete show. But that is all the time we have. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.